My second presentation today, a little bit different. I would talk to you now about some projects that we've been doing previously before we got very, very heavy into the CVI aspect. This was a large-scale study, about 5-6 years, looking at video game use in blind children, blind individuals in general, ocular blind, to try to develop navigation skills and orientation mobility skills. So very, very different in terms of what we talked about earlier this morning, but nonetheless trying to come towards this using this evidence-based neuroscience-driven approach, and hopefully you'll have questions for this as well, and I am available to stay and discuss also the CVI talk as well. So let's get started. In the same way that I started off my first presentation, I kind of want to get sort of the lay of the land with you and try to give you a sense of how the thought process came about for this project. And understand that I'm going to show you in about 4 or 5 slides what I was thinking about for like 3-4 years, so trying to compress all that. So here's the first thing to think about. Rehabilitation in the case of wayfinding and navigation. Obviously a big, big challenge for all the people that we work with, right? So fortunately we have a structured way to teach people with visual impairments how to find their way around. We call that, of course, orientation and mobility instruction. Everything from a cane to a guide dog, for example, all very structured, well-established techniques that are really part and parcel to promote an individual's independence. There are limitations, of course, with this, and there are always people and O&M instructors reaching out to me and saying, you know, what do you think about this technology? What do you think about this approach? And so on. Is this a way that we can study this and incorporate it in a more structured fashion? And I became very, very interested in this idea. Some other individuals, Dan Kish, for example, you probably have heard about this guy who uses echolocation. They call him the human Batman. He walks around making click noises and using the reflections off the surfaces of objects. He's able to identify various objects, and in this particular case you see him riding his bicycle. Even though he has prosthetic eyes, he has absolutely no light perception. I don't know if everybody can learn this skill. It's certainly really quite remarkable, and there have been some groups in Canada who have done fMRI in him and studied his brain and how he's able to do it. But it's quite a remarkable skill that he's developed. Some technology that I think is quite interesting as well. This is an interesting one. This is from the Sendero group out of California, and the idea is that you walk around with a GPS monitor which tracks you. And as you're walking through the city, and you connect this with, say, your Braille note, you get information about, for example, the name of the street, how far you are from a particular destination. You may use a Bluetooth connector as well to get some auditory input. Some very, very nice technology that's coming together to help enhance these skills, if you will. Certainly limitations. The big one with GPS, of course, is that it's only for outdoors, right? GPS doesn't work in an indoor environment. It also is quite limited when you're in a situation of being downtown, where there's a lot of reflections from buildings and so on. Satellite doesn't capture. You have to be visible in order for this to work. So we were thinking about what was out there, what could we change. In particular, we were very, very motivated, or trying to get to this idea of motivation, I should say. How can we leverage motivation as a way to improve navigation skills? So let's talk about a few things as well. First point I want to make from a clinical rehabilitation standpoint, a general comment that I'd like to make with you. So in traditional therapy session, the patient works one-on-one with a therapist to address specific goals like psychological issues, could be movement foci or a particular skill, in the hopes of improving that particular deficit or that particular function. So for example, if a person has a phobia or a particular psychological issue, they work one-on-one with a therapist, voicing those concerns, walking through those issues, and trying to make that one-on-one FaceTime, that exchange, to work through that issue. If you are working on the motor side, very, very often what we see is a lot of repetition, right? Working with various tasks, a particular skill, a motion deficit that's trying to get enhanced through repetition and repeated exercises and so on, right? You all agree with me, that's sort of like the state of the affairs right now. Here's my problem, all right? A couple of things to think about. What is the ecological validity and the effect of context on therapy? If I'm sitting with a therapist talking about my problems and I'm not having the problem, how good am I transmitting that issue, right? Similarly, if that therapist is providing me some strategies and I'm still not going through that problem, how good am I in terms of transferring that into that situation, in that scenario? So the context, the immersion of learning the skill is extremely important. That's the first thing I want to say. The second aspect, if we look on the motor side of things, right, boredom kills us when it comes to rehabilitation, right? Everybody recognize this toy, right? This little stacker thing? I don't know about you, I was 3 when I had one, right? Here's a woman who just had a stroke in her 40s, struggling to do something that she knows was designed for a 3-year-old. What does that do in terms of her motivation and struggles and so on? So I really think the ecological validity in the context of therapy is extremely important. We certainly can do better. So the immersion aspect, I think, is extremely important, and creating scenarios that are meaningful for that individual are also extremely important. Right? So let's get to some other pieces of the puzzle, and I'm slowly going to edge into this idea of gaming and how we got into that. The times are changing, definitely, right? For example, here, daily emails, 2000, 12 billion emails being sent. We're now 247 in 2010. Text messages, 400,000 up to 4.5 billion, right? Time spent online, 2.7 hours a week to 18 hours a week. Moral of the story, we are a tech-driven society. Right? A lot of what we do is intimately related to what we do with technology. And as I said, despite my early screensaver problems, I believe that technology is an enabler, and we should try to leverage that somehow. And we're getting very, very good at it because costs are going down. Everybody has a cell phone. Everybody has email. Everybody has ways to stay connected. There's an opportunity here that I think we need to leverage. A couple of other things to talk about. The case for play. As I mentioned, my mother is a preschool teacher, and she used to always tell me a child who plays is a healthy child. Right? It's intimately related. And indeed, play is extremely important in the development of a child. Role-playing, social interactions, what's fair, what's not, establishing a rapport with kids, all that is done at a very, very early age, and I think that's also what makes games later in life very, very exciting as well. It's a way to be somebody in a sense that you can't otherwise be. Animals know this, right? Young animals play fight, and they know when they can bite, when they can't, and so on. So there's something very important about play and brain development that I think is very, very interesting. And think of the counterexample. This is a child with autism. It's a child who doesn't play. Right? And that's one of the hallmark signs of a child with autism as well. So I think there is somehow an association between playing and brain development and so on, and many, many news stories that have been out there trying to get at this point. Here's an interesting study. I don't know if you heard about this one, called the HighScope study. This was done in the state of Michigan, done by the Educational Research Foundation in Michigan, a longitudinal study by Stuart Brown. So what he found that by age 23, he compared individuals who went through a very, very structured, didactic school program versus schools who had a lot of hours of playtime and interaction. And what he found, by age 23, more than a third of the kids who had attended an instruction-oriented preschool had been arrested for a felony, as compared to fewer than 1/10 of the kids who had been in a play-oriented preschool. Now, doesn't mean you don't play, you're going to rob a bank. Right, this isn't causality, but a very, very interesting association that having this early on in development certainly seems to have a benefit from brain development as well. So those questions earlier on about CVI, how do I wake up the visual brain? Consider play as one of the ways to do it from an engagement standpoint. And I hope to convince you that there's a neuroplastic and a neuroscience reason behind this as well. Learning through simulation, another piece of the puzzle, very, very important. The best example to give you is flight simulators. If you are a pilot wanting to learn how to fly a new plane or how to land at a new airport or how to fly in very, very challenging conditions, much better that you do this in a simulator than a complement of 350 people behind you, right? If you make a mistake, better you learn it there than you do it in the real world, right? So pilots spend an enormous amount of time in flight simulators, and this has been extremely effective and has revolutionized the airline industry. And they have something what's called the transfer of effectiveness ratio, which is about 50%, which means every 2 hours that you spend in a flight simulator is the equivalent of 1 hour real flight time. So what you learn in the simulator, going through the motions, preparing yourself mentally, serves into the real world. And the closer that immersion is, the better it is in terms of the transference. Also, people have learned this. Surgical, for example, the medical field is spending a lot of money looking at surgical simulations. Better I make the mistake resecting a tumor in a simulation than I do in the real world. The military is also spending a lot of money in this as well. So learning by simulation seems to be another thing that the brain likes. And again, I'll show you some evidence of that. Here are some great examples of how video games and virtual reality are being used in therapy in your own world. This is work by Elizabeth Strickland. What she has is she has children with cognitive development issues, and trying to teach them basic skills like crossing the street safely. So she has these kids wearing a virtual reality helmet, and they do associations, right? They call this game called street safety. They associate good behaviors with certain friends, bad behaviors with other individuals, and they go through these simulations learning to cross safely. Better you learn this in the safe, controlled environment of a classroom than learning this in the real world the hard way, so to speak. You learn these skills in a safe, controlled environment. You have reinforcement, you have repetition, again, things that the brain likes, and then you transfer that to the real world. So very, very interesting approach. Another one that's quite nice, this is called IREX. This is a gesture talk. This is a group out of Israel that have developed an interesting system. This is a child with cerebral palsy who doesn't want to go to rehab, right? Sorry, I'm sounding like Amy Winehouse there. How do you get him to go to rehab? No. He goes, well, what I do like is soccer, right? So he has this system here where they use a small camera, they film him, they project it on a blue screen, and he's the goalie while people take shots. And the idea is that he reaches over one side, blocks the ball, reaches to the other side, blocks the ball. Then they can go systematically crossing the hemifield, the other hemispace as well. And all this is quantified, as you can see on the bottom row there. They've got his favorite team playing, his favorite players are playing, he's engaged, now he wants to go and he's engaged. So again, you can do good work with play and under simulation. This is a chance to try to awaken the brain and motivate individuals. Let's talk specifically more about video games and whether or not I think this is a good idea. You probably all remember when Pong came out. We thought this was, oh my God, I gotta get Pong, right? This is revolutionary, right? Now think about how games have evolved, right? It's really interesting. We've moved outside of the arcade and now moved it to our own personal devices. So it's really interesting that the goals remain the same, but the space that we work in has changed dramatically. Here's some interesting statistics. World of Warcraft, which is a role-playing game, is a very, very interesting one because they actually log on the time that people spend. And here are some interesting stats. Since 1994, collectively gamers have spent close to 6 million years playing this game. That's geological timescale, right? The Grand Canyon was built in 6 million years, right? One game, right? And the average gamer spends 22 hours a week. That's a part-time job, right? These people spend a lot of time playing video games. Another interesting book called Reality is Broken by Jane McGonigal. She's a game designer and also a sociologist, very, very interested in that. And she says in countries with strong gaming culture, by the age of 21, the average gamer will have spent close to 10,000 hours playing video games, which is the equivalent of time you spend from the 5th grade to high school graduation if you have perfect attendance. That's a lot of time spending in front of a monitor. So they're doing it, is what I'm trying to say. Can we leverage this somehow, right? Other things. Are video games useful from a rehabilitation standpoint? I'm going to give you a couple of other recent examples. Rehabilitation, you're all familiar with the Wiimote, right? This idea it basically has a gyroscope in it, and it can sense directions in 3 axes of motion and translates that onto a monitor as you interact. Some interesting work with stroke recovery. Again, I don't think the evidence is very, very clear how positive it is, and there could be a huge placebo effect of just simply being engaged with a group and so on, which may account for some of the benefits that are there. But indeed, people are studying this and looking how to engage individuals. The social interaction, for example, as well. Wii bowling, for example, in a lot of situations, promoting social interaction and so on. A lot easier to do this in a virtual living room than it is to actually take them all in a particular site. So there's some benefit in that as well that I think is quite interesting. Another interesting study here, impact of video games on training surgeons in the 21st century. There was a link, and I quote here, a link between skill at video gaming and skill at laparoscopic surgery. Current video game players made 31% fewer errors, were 24% faster, and scored 26% better overall than non-player colleagues. Again, not causal. Doesn't mean you should be playing video games, then go to medical school. The point is that there was an association between the two, right? It's an observational study. So something, again, kind of connecting from a skill standpoint. And the last one I'll share you, which I was really, really struck with, this was a study that was published in Nature a couple years ago. And to give you sort of a background, I'm not a biochemist, but apparently when it comes to figuring out the 3-dimensional shape of a protein or a molecule, it's really, really difficult. It's really complicated. It's like a mental teaser or a puzzle and so on. And even with some of the fastest computers, it takes months and months and years to figure out this 3-dimensional shape. So this group of investigators decided to come up with a game called Fold It. And the idea was to go online. There were various rules of how you could fold this particular shape, and they just kind of left it out into the world to see what would happen. And they said that using folded, the 3D conformational structure of a protein was solved in roughly 1 week, right? By individuals with no specific training in biochemistry. The best scientists were trying to figure this out, and they couldn't do it with the fastest computers. And all these guys went online who had no interest in biochemistry whatsoever, and they solved it in a week, right? So gaming somehow brings the best out of us, right? We think in a way that we don't typically think in more sort of didactic fashions. And I think, again, that's another aspect that I want to submit to you. Another interesting example in our field, this was a work by Dennis Levi at University of California, Berkeley, using video games to try to improve amblyopia, visual acuity. It was a very preliminary study, but what they found that a lot of the kids who were going through this and interacting with video games showed improvement in their visual acuity, a couple of lines. Again, largely an observational study. There were a lot of randomization and control issues, and I think it needs to be replicated, but showing you that we can take this also directly from a visual acuity standpoint or a visual performance standpoint as well. Now, why do I think games work? I'm going to give you what I call my neuroscience rationale. So all video games have 3 really important aspects. It doesn't matter whether it's Pac-Man or World of Warcraft or so on, they all kind of have these 3 basic features. The first one is that there's always attainable rewards. Jewels, points, munitions, portals, the epic win feeling, and so on for my World of Warcraft colleagues. There's also task novelty and graded difficulties. All games start off really, really easy, and they get a little bit harder, and they seem to be almost perfectly paced with you. And they're just at the point where you don't give up, right? You never just say, oh, I don't want to play this anymore. You just, okay, one more try. And figuring out that the gradation is obviously a big, big key. And this idea of having attainable goals. And the last one is they always have high attention demands, right? Survival pressure, death, right? Time constraints, monsters, all this sort of thing keeps you engaged, obviously, into the game, right? Well, what does this mean? Well, first of all, reward is intimately related to dopamine, right? Novelty and goals is intimately related to serotonin and noradrenaline. And finally, attention is intimately related with acetylcholine, or the cholinergic system. The point here is that we are wired for this, right? We like this. Good video game designers understand our brain chemistry, and in a sense are tapping into this to get us engaged. And my argument is that there's an opportunity here that we don't typically have. And how do we jumpstart the brain? This may be one way to do it. So here is the study that I want to share with you. You probably remember this video game, Doom, right? Came out early 90s, yeah? I wasted years of my life playing this game. It is really, really addictive, for lack of a better term. It is amazing. It was one of the first games of its type, what's called a 3D first-person shooter game, where you walk through a virtual labyrinth. And I'm just going to show you a video. If you're not familiar with this, we're going to be doing this. We got the loud music going on, very, very high paced. You're walking through this 3-dimensional environment. You got to kill the bad guys. You got to find your way back through the corridors. Very, very high paced, very engaged. You get a sense right away of what's going on here. Well, I'll spare you the violence. The point here is that to play this game, to succeed in this game, is you have to build a mental map of your mind, of the world that you're walking through, right? You have to get a sense that, okay, I walked through this corridor, or I've been in this room before, or I came in from another perspective. So as you play the game, you develop a cognitive map in your mind, right? All right. That being said, I have a colleague from the University of Chile who's who's a computer scientist and develops video games for blind children. And the game that he developed was Audio Doom, which is exactly the same thing, except it's based purely on audio cues. And I'll explain to you more on how that works, all right? So as you see here, just like kids, sighted kids of their peers, these blind kids play the game forever. They love it. They're completely engaged, hours and hours playing the game. And the other thing he noticed from an observational standpoint was the kids who played the game were doing better in school. They seemed to be better at math. They seemed to be better at spatial reasoning. They were much more engaged socially with their peers than the kids who didn't seem to like video games. Again, not causal, but an interesting association nonetheless. So the thought was there an opportunity here? And there was another interesting piece that really sparked my interest when I first saw this. For example, here, if I give you a target environment like this, so this is the labyrinth. The child comes in here, this is a door, another door, a dead end. They go through another dead end, series of monsters, and so on, and they got to find their way to a portal that takes them to the next level. right? If you give the child Lego pieces and ask them to build the map that they walk through, they can build a perfect one-to-one representation of the virtual world they walk through, right? They have the map in their mind, even though they've never seen the map, all based on auditory cues. In fact, these are congenitally blind children, so they've never seen the world, period, but nonetheless, they can build the map in their mind. So they can generate this through non-visual cues. So the question is this: why not play the game in a world that actually exists and use that as a way to teach orientation, mobility, and navigation? That's exactly what we did. So we invented a game using the same sort of strategy, and this is the layout of an actual physical building at the Carroll Center for the Blind. We have the kids play the game, and the goal here is kind of like Pac-Man. You got to rove through this building, you got to find these little jewels that you see in blue squares, and I'll show you a video of how the game is played. And you also have to be careful of these red guys. These are the monsters, right? And if they catch you with the jewel, they hide the jewel somewhere else. So it forces you to kind of keep exploring the building and so on. And you have to catch as many jewels as you can and not get caught by the jewel. So we engage them to do this. They then play the game, then we physically take them to the building and say, okay, now that you have this map in your mind, can you find their way? The important thing to keep in mind is that at no time do we tell them this is the goal of the study. We just simply say, this is a game, this is how you play it, and then we see what happens, all right? So a little bit more details about this. As I said, this was done at the Carroll Center for the Blind in Newton, Massachusetts, a little bit outside of Boston. We chose this building here, which is the St. Paul building. The reason why is because this is an administrative building, or at least it was at the time, and the kids had no prior knowledge of the layout of the building there. It's a two-story building, has about 20 rooms. Allows us to do sort of a real-world scenario, 2 floors, look at, for example, interactions between floors and so on. And as I said, they don't have any prior experience with this building when they come to the campus. They play the game, as I mentioned. We never say, you know, memorize the layout or anything along those lines. We just say play the game, and then we take them physically there, and we have a series of outcomes to see how well they're able to learn the routes. All right, so more details about how the game works. And we call this ABIS, for Audio-Based Environment Simulator, or ABIS. We don't have as clever a name as Audio Doom, but this is how it works. So you're all familiar with icons, right? The waste paper basket, for example, on your computers where you put documents you don't like. So we use earcons, exactly the same thing. So to give you an example is a knocking sound. So I think I can play this one here. Right? If you hear that sound, you know that that's the presence of a door. If I hear that knocking sound in my right ear, that means the door is on my right side. If I hear the knocking sound in my left ear, I know the door is in my left side. If I hear it in front of me, the door is in front of me. Keep in mind that also when I'm walking through the environment and I hear that knocking sound in my right ear, if I turn around 180 degrees and come back, I now need to hear the knocking sound in my left ear, right? So what the software is doing is keeping track of your egocentric heading and presenting the sounds in a spatialized manner so that you can build the spatial map in your mind as you interact with it. Okay? So we use cardinal coordinates, north, south, west, east, so they can always kind of work in that rigid cardinal coordinate system. As I said, left ear, right ear, either with speakers or with headphones. And every step they take is measured or scaled to an actual physical step in that building. So here's a video of a child playing the game. And remember, they don't see anything on the screen, right? I'm just simply showing you this so we can track them what the actual movement is. So here they go.
East.
Knock on the door, open it, walk in. That's the warning sound that there's a jewel. As they get closer and closer to the jewel, the loudness of the sound happens, allows them to get organized. They're getting oriented to where that sound is. They get the jewel. They got to go outside now. Take it outside. The red dots, as I mentioned, are the monsters roving around, trying to catch you.
Stairwell 1. East.
That's an obstacle.
North. You leave 1 July.
Outside, yay, applause, points.
West.
Come
South.
back.
First floor. Stairwell 1. West.
This is the stairwell. As they climb the stairs, the pitch increases.
You are halfway.
Second floor.
East.
And they get to the top there.
Second
And they keep
floor.
exploring and exploring and exploring. And they play for a total of about an hour and 30 minutes, an hour and a half. All right? Completely engaged. As I said, they see nothing on the screen. That's just for us to track them to see where they're heading. And believe me, it's tough to get this out of their hands. They're really, really engaged in playing this game. Here's the study design. As I said, we did this as a randomized clinical trial. So we took all comers into the study. I'll give you more details. And we randomized them into 3 actual groups. And before I show you the 3 groups, let me show you the breakdown of the various aspects. You can play ABIS, the video game, if you will, in directed navigation mode. Right? This means that I give you a start place and an end place, and you learn the layout of the building. And what we did is we pair each child or each individual in the study with an orientation mobility instructor who sits next to them and teaches them step by step the layout of the building. All right, the same way, a virtual replication, if you will, of what they would do in an actual O&M instruction of that building. All right, so they work one-on-one with an orientation mobility instructor. Right, so that's called structured learning, or the directed navigator arm of the study. The other arm is the one, really, the intervention of interest, is the gaming arm. Is exactly as I said. You know, there are monsters, there are stairwells, and so on. We simply explain to the child or the individual, this is how the game is played. This is the goal. You got to find these jewels that are hidden throughout the building. You got to avoid the monsters. If they catch you, they hide the jewels somewhere else. And the more jewels you can find, the better it is in terms of your score. We never tell them you have to explicitly learn the layout of the building. We just simply say, this is how you play the game. So now, as I said, this was a 3-arm randomized clinical trial where we had 3 arms in the study. Some were enrolled or randomized to the directed navigator arm, again working with an orientation mobility instructor. Some were playing the game arm, and some were in the control group. So this was a game, but the building had nothing to do with the target that we're trying to get. So we wanted to see the potential benefit of actually playing the game itself, even though the overall target wasn't matching. They go through, they play, as I said, for about an hour and a half. Each one arm, we look at their proficiency of virtual navigating, so going from target A to target B, or target C to target D, and so on. We look at whether or not they can do it and how long they take. We also then transfer them to the real world. We take them to the physical building and see whether or not they can use those transferred skills, what they learn in terms of their map. And then the last thing we look at is what are called drop-off tasks, which you're all familiar with in the O&M world. So in other words, instead of asking them to just go A and B, C and D, E and F, we bring them to various positions in the building and we say, where you're standing now, what's the shortest way out of the building? Right? So we give them sort of a task to force them to manipulate the information in their mind. So that's the drop-off task in this. So just to remind you, the comparison of direct navigation versus game tells us something about the method of instruction. Right? The comparison of the control group versus the game tells us something about the gaming context. And that's why we have the 3 arms. Okay? So let's take a look at some of the data. Before I do, here's some more information. The inclusion criteria, we took 18-year-olds, anywhere aged between 18 and 45. I'll show you a youth study that we did specifically right after that, male and female, with documented legal blindness before the age of 3, and blindness of ocular cause. Regardless of their level of visual acuity or residual visual function, they were all blindfolded throughout the study as they played the game. Outcome measures were things of the number of paths that they got correct, the time, target, and also what we call creativity points. In other words, how well were they able to find their way out the quickest way possible? And I'll explain to you that more specifically. Qualitative things like the types of errors they made, things, for example, like strategies employed, all that was documented as well to get a sense of what was happening. Stopping rules. We were given a maximum of 6 minutes per trial, and the reason for this is that we didn't want to have people just indefinitely exploring and then finding their way. So you had 6 minutes maximum before we went to the next step. And we also had a stopping rule in terms of 3 successive trials to move on to the next one. So if you weren't able to get 3 in a row at the very, very beginning, we stopped the study completely. There was a lot of concern from the Carroll Center that a lot of these kids might get dejected from the performance as well. So we had these stopping rules in there to try to get away from any concerns. And I can tell you that it actually never happened. It was actually quite straightforward. The analysis, again, just some details here in terms of how we were able to do that. And just to give you some details, the software, the nice thing about it is that it allows us to quantify a lot of things. Here's the path that the individual took, right? How much time they took in the various parts. All this can be quantified and enters into the spreadsheet so we can break down the path and see areas that they struggled with versus which paths were more challenging than others. So let's take a look at some of the quick data before I give you the group analysis. So here are 2 individuals. One was in the directed navigator group, and the other one was in the gamer group. All right? So notice that when we asked them to virtually navigate from the lobby of the building all the way through up the stairwell to the 2nd floor to bedroom 6, it took them about 1 minute and 42 seconds to do it. The reason why I chose this path is it's actually the longest path in the building physically. And they took about 1 minute 42 seconds to do it. When we take them to the building and ask them to do the same thing, they can do it in a little bit shorter time. Part of that is the physical translation, and the second part is the fact that they're doing the task twice, obviously. The thing that's noticeable is notice that the gamers did it equally well in about the same amount of time as well. So whether you learn this as a directed navigator or you learn this as a gamer, you were able to do this. Those individuals in the 3rd arm, the control group, weren't able to transfer at all, as you might imagine. They got there and we say, get to bedroom 6, and they're like, what's bedroom 6, right? So the context aspect obviously was crucial. None of the individuals in that control group, that third arm, were able to do the task. Here's what's interesting. Once they're at bedroom 6, for example, this particular location, we asked them, what's the quickest way out of the building? The gamers always find the quickest way out. The directed navigators just retrace their path the way that they came in, right? Which is probably not surprising to you, all right? So something tells us that the way that they manipulate the information from the gaming, learning it through gaming, versus how they do it through directed navigation is probably different. Even though they're very similar on the first task, getting from A to B, C to D, how they manipulate that information seems to be very different. This is how we quantified it. If you can get the quickest way out, there was always 3 ways at least to get out of the building. If you find the shortest route, we give you 3 points. If you find the second shortest route, we give you 2 points. And if you find the longest route, that's 1. And if you get lost, you can't find your way in the 6 minutes, you get 0. Pretty simple, and we call those creativity points, right? So, the other thing, just very, very quickly notice how they're actually shorelining? Very, very similar to what they actually do in the real world as well. They use very, very much the same strategies in the virtual world that they actually do in the real world as well. Okay, here's the hard data, and there was over 31, I have the number here, or the 31 subjects who participated in this study. Again, I'm not showing you the control arm group because none of the people were able to do that. I'm going head-to-head comparison of those in the directed navigator arms versus those in the gaming arms, and I've separated them from early blind to late blind as well, into 2 groups as well, because we wanted to see whether prior visual imagery had somehow an effect on the possible performance as well. And here's the data. So in the early blind group, whether you learned through gaming in red or navigating through blue, you had almost 90% correct. You could find your route very, very easily in this regard. There was no statistical difference between the 2 groups. In the case of late blind, very, very similar performance as well. So take-home message 1, they are able to do this task quite well. Almost 90%, anywhere between 80 to 90% performance or correctness trying to find that route. And it's the same whether you were a directed navigator or a gamer, and it was the same whether you're early blind versus late blind. The drop-off task, the creativity task, if you will, is where we saw the biggest difference, right? The gamers always, or in general, were always able to find the shorter routes, whereas the directed navigators always choose the longer paths as well. And this is true whether you were early blind or late blind, and this was statistically significant as well. All right? So we also did a follow-up study in terms of adolescents, because a lot of concerns that we had is that, well, if you do the virtual navigation first, you're basically consolidating the path in your mind, and then when I take you to the physical place, you're just executing on that path. So we redid the study design in a way to try to get specifically at that question. And we did this specifically also in teens, between 14 and 18 years old. And this is how we designed it in this particular case. We enrolled them, they played Abyss, the video game, and there were 2 randomized arms. In the first case, you did the direct route, then you did the drop-off task, and the second arm, you did the drop-off task, then you did the route. So there was no carryover effect of what you did on the first task versus the other. It was a wash in this. And what we found in this case, very, very similar performance. The direct navigation route, task 1, mean performance was about 70%. Task 2, the drop-off task, mean performance was 97, right? So the gamers all did very, very well in this. And the other thing too is the mean shortest path was about 71%. So 71% of the time, they would typically take the shortest path. Right? So the gaming itself, whether they learned, whatever the task order was, seemed to indeed allow this potential benefit of transfer in the navigation task. A couple other things to think about, which was interesting. In terms of their performance, we noticed that the more jewels they found, in other words, the better they played the game, the better their overall performance was. This is true for task 1 and task 2. So the better you played the game, the better you actually learned, and the better you actually transferred into the real world. In contrast, if you look at performance as a function of number of years of O&M skill, there was no association. So it wasn't biased by the fact that these kids may have had more independence or were better at orientation and mobility. We found that there was no significant association between the 2. Performance was actually directly correlated to how well you played the game. Okay, so various results to think about. So first of all, as I said, it's about an 85% success rate when it comes to just going from one target to another, A to B. There was a correlation between navigation success and gameplay. Other things that we noticed, alternate routes were typically found when you learned it through gaming as opposed to direct didactic instruction. And recall also, the gamers were never told to learn the layout, right? They basically learned the layout for free. We just simply said, this is a game, this is how you play it, and they got the map for free just by interacting with the map. And the argument I would make to you is that those maps were more flexible. The way that they manipulated the information in their mind as a gamer was very, very different than the case of a directed navigator, which is what I'm summarizing here. So in both cases, they're able to form the map in their mind, they're able to transfer that to a real-world setting. But what I would submit to you is that in the case of directed navigators, they were somewhat constrained, if you will, because of the didactic learning. They could only use the information that they were taught, right? So structured, basically what you would call root knowledge, right, in terms of O&M, whereas the gamers, exploratory learning, self-discovery and pace, allowed a certain cognitive flexibility that they didn't have in the case of the directed navigators, and you might want to call this survey knowledge, for example, in the case of O&M. Right? So big difference in terms of how they were able to perform, even though similar performances in some aspects, very different performance differences in other aspects as well. So how does the brain do this, right? At the end of the day, we stick everybody into the scanner, right? That's what we do, right? It's all about getting to the scanner. So let's talk about the neuroscience behind this. That was the behavioral aspect. How do they do this now? So let me tell you a little bit of background behind navigation and so on and how the brain does this. A lot of the first initial work about navigation and finding your way, interestingly enough, was done studying London taxi drivers. If you've ever been to London, you know that that's just a terrible place to drive, right? Imagine being a taxi driver. And if you want to be licensed in the City of London to drive a taxi, you have to do something what's called the knowledge, where you spend 2 years of intensive teaching, I should say, or intensive learning, memorizing the map of London. And they go through very, very interesting exercises where they have to close their eyes and mentally imagine the route that they would take. So they close their eyes and the instructor will say, okay, you pick up a fare at Piccadilly, how do you bring them to Buckingham Palace? So it's like this, I turn this right, go 3 streets, turn right, left, so on. And they memorize that map through this mental exercise all the time. They go 2 years of this before they actually get the license to drive. Very, very clever. It was Eleanor Maguire who studied this in London and her students, and they had a very, very clever idea. They decided to take these taxi drivers and look at their hippocampus, which you know is the part of the brain responsible for memory and spatial learning. And what they found is, not only was it larger in these London taxi drivers, it was actually correlated with the number of years that they drove the taxi. So there is structural evidence that their part of the brain physically changed. They then compared that to Londoners who drive in London but weren't taxi drivers, and there was absolutely no change over time. So their hippocampus was bigger than an aged matched Londoner who didn't drive a taxi, and it got bigger the longer you drove a taxi as well. So it's interesting associative evidence between the two. The other thing that they figured out was the network of the part of the brains, or the part of the brain that was responsible for it. So interesting pieces. The parietal cortex, you probably know, again, responsible for spatial processing. Hippocampus, as I mentioned, in terms of memory and route learning. The frontal cortex involved with executive decisions, right? And of course, the visual cortex, because you have to use visual information around you and integrate that. And how do they figure all that out? Using video games, right? So this is Crazy Taxi in London. They took London taxi drivers and asked them to play the video game in the scanner, right? And they identified all these areas that I mentioned, you know, parietal cortex, visual cortex, frontal areas, and so on. So here's video games showing up again, allowing us to figure out what a taxi driver's brain looks like in terms of the map. So with that in mind, we went back to our gamers, and this is how we did it. So this is a sighted control in the fMRI scanner. He's looking through a mirror here, going through the video game like this. He's using headphones, looking through the mirror. He can see the screen projected behind him. He's using a series of keys to move left and right and so on, exactly the same way that you would with the keyboard of a laptop. And he's doing this visually. We then bring in our blind participants and doing exactly the same thing. Obviously the monitor isn't on, and we compare the two in terms of how they're able to do that. What we found is, sure enough, a network of activation very, very similar to what we saw in the taxi drivers as well. So visual areas, auditory cortex is active, right, because they're hearing the sounds. Frontal areas, very, very important for executive decisions. We also saw activations in motor areas. This is because they're using the keys, moving around. And sure enough, activation of visual cortex, and as well as a parahippocampus, which you see right now. So all the areas that were identified in the London taxi study, we found the same network in our sighted participants as well. What do you think the brain looks like in our ocular blind participants? The same. Yeah, exactly the same. Same areas. Auditory, motor, frontal, visual cortex, parahippocampus. Again, the connectivity is all there. They're using the same network, even though they're not necessarily using that visual information the same way. So they're driving the same system through another portal, if you will. Let's look at this a little bit more systematically, all right? So for example, here, all this brain activation and so on, is it indeed related to the actual video game? Here's a blind individual. We asked them to just simply listen to the instructions. Don't play the game, don't move, don't do anything. Just listen to the instructions. And we have activation in auditory cortex. And we also have activation in sensory motor areas because they're mentally imagining doing that motion. Here's the same individual just randomly walking. So they're listening to the cues, and we just say, walk in a circle. Don't go anywhere. And again, activation in auditory cortex and sensory motor areas as well. Now we ask the individual, we want you to walk from A to B, C to D in a goal-directed fashion, and that's where you see everything light up, right? So it's the engagement that does this, right? Again, going back to that earlier question, how do you turn the brain on? Make it do something really hard. It really likes that. That's how you create all that engagement. Other things that were kind of interesting, we started looking at all our participants one by one, and we saw a really, really wide variability in terms of activation. We saw some people really, really locked in, all sorts of activation everywhere. Another individual, less so, right? Then we saw other individuals that had really, really strong visual cortex activation. Other individuals, basically nothing, or we're using other areas of the brain were active. So we wanted to make sense of this. Why were everybody who was playing this game using different parts of their brain, right? What was behind this? Is there somehow we can take these individuals and associate that with their performance in terms of the game and how they were actually using information? So the way that we decided to do this, trying to associate brain activity with behavior, is we used a rationale, and this gets back to the earlier question about ROP that I promised I would allude to. So we used something called the development of self-report measures of environmental spatial ability. This was done by Mary Hagerty, and she developed a scale that was first developed for sighted individuals, translated for the blind, in terms of trying to figure out how independent an individual was in terms of their orientation, mobility, and navigation skills. So it's questions like, I'm very good at giving directions on a scale of, say, 1 to 8, 8 being very good, 1 being very poor. I have trouble understanding directions, right? So notice the negativity on this one. So we ask it in both ways to make sure that we don't get biased by one polarity versus the other. I can usually remember a new route after I have traveled it only once, scale of 1 to 8. And then it goes through analysis and it gives you an independence score. The higher your number, the more theoretically independent you are and the more confident you are in terms of your travel, all right? Here are our 9 participants in the fMRI study, ranked ordered by their independence score from 1 to 9. And what do you notice? Retinopathy of prematurity is in the lower half, right? So just a first piece about this aspect of whether or not ROP is somehow related with spatial aspects. But I'll get back to that during the question period. The main thing that I thought was quite interesting is that their independence score was really interestingly related with their primary mobility. So the top independents were long cane users. The middle scores were using guide dogs, and the lower scores were all people, for example, using the ride program or having a driver taking them around and so on. And remember, we don't ask this specifically. This actually came out as a function of the questionnaire that we asked. So they were rank ordered, and it seemed to parallel very, very much their primary mobility aids as well. So we had a good sense that we were able to rank order these individuals in a real world setting. When we do that, we take this scale, we put that into an equation based on brain activity, and we ask the software to tell us what part of the brain correlates the best with their independence. And the part of the brain was this area here called the temporal parietal junction, or TPJ. Right? So there's the correlation analysis, brain activation as a function of their independence score. And of all the parts of the brain, this is the one that was intimately related to their independence level. And the reason why I think this is interesting is TPJ is the part of the brain that's normally active when we tell ourselves stories. So it's kind of interesting that those individuals who are the most independent in terms of navigation are probably the people who somehow necessarily can rehearse that story in their mind of where they're going. It wasn't necessarily the visual cortex, it wasn't necessarily frontal cortex. The part of the brain that kind of sits in the middle of everything, between parietal, visual, temporal, and frontal. The nexus, if you will, of all these brain areas. That was the part of the brain most correlated with it. Okay, where are we heading now? So we started very, very simply with this idea. We took one building, tried to map it, and tried to turn try to get a sense of the neuroscience and all these aspects. Our goal now is to map out the entire campus, as you might imagine. You can imagine going from one building to another, to another, to another, and we call this sort of audio Zelda, where you find the key in one building, which gives you the map into another building, which forces you to find the other building, to again sort of engage them and map out the whole entire campus. You can also think of this might be something that you can put on a CD or maybe downloadable from space, or from cloud space, I should say. And if you have a client coming to the Carroll Center, they can go and play the game on their own time, and once they arrive at Carroll, they have already a good idea of what the layout is of the campus. That's our goal right now in a particular study, and we are working towards that. We've changed the platform. We're using something called Unity, which is a very, very simple way to program virtual environments. The nice thing about it is that you can use virtually any platform you want. Android, Mac, PlayStation, however they want to interact with the game, they can use whatever interface they want. So you build it once, play it everywhere, sort of thing. So very, very fast, allows us to create these environments. Just showing you here, we call it HAGA now for haptic audio game application, because we're adding tactile components to it as well. Here's the indoor environment, there's the outdoor environment, here's a blind individual you can see interacting with it. So using the audio, as I mentioned before, and also using the rumble feature of the Xbox controller as well. So when they hit an obstacle, they get the feedback, and as they strafe, the frequency changes as well. So there's tactile feedback as well as audio. You also notice this device here. It's called the Falcon, the Novit Falcon. This is a force feedback device. So they can also use that to knock on the door, to use it also as a virtual cane. So all sorts of immersion between the audio as well as the haptic tactile as well, to give them that sense of the indoor and outdoor environment. And this is in the works right now. Other things we've played with, the Wiimote, as I mentioned, is sort of an interesting way to use that as a virtual cane. So getting that rumble feature. The problem with the Wiimote is that if you hit an obstacle, you can still put your arm through it. So it starts vibrating. So the nice thing about the Falcon is that it actually gives you that force feedback. The Wiimote is just an alarm. It doesn't really give you that same sort of tactile immersion. But nonetheless, interesting. This was work that we did in Chile. Child learned the layout of a park. We take the child there and we can track them, and using that sort of sense, they build a map of the layout of the park using the Wiimote as one way to do that. Audiopolis, another interesting way. This is a fictional environment. Same sort of strategy. We have the child play again, audio as well as the Wiimote. The goal here is to chase a thief that's stolen in this virtual city. You have to find the thief, and every building you find leaves cues for the next building you have to find, and you kind of go through in a structured fashion. At the end, we give you just the blocks, and you have to rebuild the environment that you worked with, and we again kind of get a sense of the child's spatial skills, how they put the environment together. We've seen, for example, a lot of kids flip it, for example. They know the very short linear relationship between buildings, but globally they have distortion. So it allows us to kind of diagnose what aspect of their spatial representation seems to be imperative at all. Other things that we've done. We now embarked with the Massachusetts Bay Transit Authority, the MBTA. This runs the subway and the bus system in Boston. If you're from Boston, you might recognize this. This is Park Street Station. And we have a situation now where we've modeled Park Street Station in our virtual environment, hoping that this could be a similar strategy outside of the Carroll Center, now using this in public spaces as well. We can use this as an offline survey. You can learn how to explore the station before you go. You can maybe use this as an online system as well, get information when you're in the station. And it's also a way of tracking, right? So you can use this as a way of what are the most common exits that people use, for example, and you put that into a pool of data as well. Antonio Grimash is a student in my lab. He has Liebers and a very, very proficient traveler in the busway and in the Boston subway system. And he has this idea, which is very, very intriguing, of developing a strip map. And you're all familiar what a strip map is. If you take the subway, it's basically a linear representation of all the stations and the sequence, right, where the connections are and so on. So he's developing an app called Strip Map for exactly that purpose, for the Boston metro system, subway system. And it looks a little something like this. First thing you do, taking advantage of the tactile interface, the gestures, and as well as the audio that you get from your iPhone, you can ask, for example, what direction do you want to head in? How do I get from one station to another, or find the best route between two stations? You can choose the line that you want, again, just scrolling through in a strip map fashion, and it will calculate the optimal route for you. And then you get all sorts of feedback. For example, crowdsourcing tips that people put on board. You know, this is a good place to get a coffee, or this is a particularly complicated place. Live schedule. We get an immediate feed from the MBTA because of our association of when the trains are coming, when the subway is coming. If there's any delays, they have it immediately on their phone. Other accessibility services like you know, call an Uber, call a taxi, and so on. So this is in the works as well. So again, an original idea, neuroscience, now trying to translate that into real-world applications that I think people can use. And the last example I'll give you, I think a very, very interesting one. This isn't the project that I was involved with. This is my collaborators back in Chile. And this is a project called IDAC, which is Inclusión Digital para Aprender Ciencias. So this was a project that they used to use video games to teach basic anatomy and biology for blind students. In Chile, much like here in the United States, a lot of the kids are mainstream. They spend a lot of time in the public school system. And what they do is they've invented a game where a blind individual has to play with 2 or 3 sighted classmates. And the idea is to explore the world through these various rooms. And as they go through the world, they learn the anatomy together. The sighted kids see each other, right, as they move through, and the blind child is using the audio cues to navigate with them. So they're playing the game together. So it's a combination of teamwork as well as concrete tools, as well various models and things which they use together. Notice that they're visually labeled as well as Braille. Also, all the material is exactly the same. The reading material visually versus the tactile Braille material is identical. The idea is to integrate and force the teamwork, have the kids working together. Very, very interesting results. This is a long-term study with the Ministry of Education that they're doing. So I think a very, very clever idea, a very interesting approach to engage them. So, final slides. Great quote that I love. You can discover more about a person in an hour of play than a year of conversation. Turns out Plato said that. I think that's a really, really interesting idea. The fact that play somehow brings out our better nature, if you will, I think is a very interesting one, an intriguing one. We solve problems in ways that we don't normally solve in the real world. Great picture that I love. This is another one that's hanging in my office at the National Sports Center for the Disabled. You see this guide dog looking up at its master, presumably climbing this wall. I love this picture because we have this sense that individuals are only as good as their technology, right? I think the idea is to go beyond that. I think the idea is to create independence, create confidence, create a level of functioning beyond the tools that are available. And that's what I think what this picture symbolizes. And then the last one that I want to share with you just to close out, straight out of Texas folklore, which I think is very, very impression. Or sorry, let me thank a couple of individuals first. Jamie Sanchez, as I said, who a professor at the University of Chile. Aaron Connors was a research assistant working on this project. Mark Halko did the fMRI work, and of course the Carroll Center for the Blind, where we did a lot of the work. And now my final slide that I want to share with you, again, I think very, very appropriate and right out of Texas folklore. I love this. Clear eyes, full hearts, can't lose. This, every time I work with a blind child, this is what I think about. It's exactly that, right? There's so much more to seeing than the health of the eyes and also the health of the brain. And I think you can experience the world in so many different ways. And I think that's our goal. And if we do that, keep our hearts full, can't lose, right? So again, thank you very much for this afternoon.